In order to develop an action plan with potential approaches the City of Sydney could implement to increase the supply of social housing, our team developed this research question. What are the different sustainable social housing strategies used around the world that the City of Sydney could adopt to achieve their target of 7.5% social housing as outlined in the 2030 plan? In developing this research question, our team identified several global cities that are experiencing similar housing affordability issues to the City of Sydney. Our investigations into these cities were undertaken using a staged research approach. This particular case study looks at the capital of the United Kingdom, the City of London. Similar to Sydney, in London housing affordability is a major problem because housing supply is not keeping pace with demand. Affordability in both cities has deteriorated over the last 20 years and both cities are now in the midst of a housing affordability crisis. In the UK, the housing affordability is in such crisis that it was a key issue in the recent general election. Like Sydney, London is experiencing rapid population growth, possibly its fastest growth in history. London is also Europe's fastest growing city. To make matters worse, both London and Sydney are experiencing a population growth of around 1 million people over the next decade, putting further pressure on housing prices. This sustained population explosion at a time when there is chronic undersupply of new housing due to the financial crisis and recession is fueling the housing affordability crisis. Rents in London are rising at double the national rate, and like Sydney, there are ever-increasing numbers of people that are seeking social housing, but stocks are at all-time lows. In both London and Sydney, middle and low-income earners are being exiled to the fringes of the city and away from infrastructure and jobs, causing significant negative socio-economic effects. In both cities, dilapidated housing estates have become symbols of failure. Another similarity between London and Sydney is that we share similar political and planning systems, and in both cities, housing and social housing costs continue to rise while government investment is declining. The provision of social housing has become one of the most pressing challenges and is threatening the vitality of both cities. Therefore, effective strategies are a priority issue for both London and Sydney if they are to remain successful and sustainable global cities. London has adopted a mix of strategies to support social housing, including capital subsidies and fiscal incentives in the form of government grants, but also planning levers and developer incentives. Essentially, there are two main sources of funding to supply social housing in the UK: taxpayers and private developers. In the UK, the planning system is used to leverage social housing stock by making it a requirement of the development. Known as S106 agreements, the local planning authorities negotiate with developers and seek financial or other contributions such as social housing before the planning permission is granted. Essentially, developers fund the building of social and affordable homes by cross-subsidising the profits they make on market properties. In well-performing areas like London, where relatively more development is occurring, comparatively higher quantities of social housing are being built and in preferred locations. Housing associations have taken over councils and are now the main suppliers and managers of affordable homes in London and the UK. They are not-for-profit organisations that use the rent revenue and government funding to maintain existing housing stock and finance the development of new homes. In 2010, the incoming Conservative government cut grants to housing associations by 63%. As a result, housing associations have built fewer homes and the onus has been placed on the private sector developers to build social housing through S106 agreements. Despite the GFC and government cuts, London has 368 housing associations who own and manage 430,000 properties, housing 1 in 10 Londoners. They build a third of all homes in the UK and approximately 10,000 new homes every year in London, which equates to 1 in 4 new homes. In recent years, housing associations have become less reliant on government subsidies and grants, and they are assessing the risks, borrowing and reinvesting surpluses, and building increasingly more new social houses. Over the last 8 years, 100,000 affordable homes have been built in London, and about a third of that was through S106 planning agreements. The average affordable yield from these deals is 34%, which is significant given the economic climate of recent years. Figures show that in the year to April 2015, approximately 18,000 affordable properties were completed in London, which represents a near doubling of affordable housing completions from the previous years. While the planning system and housing associations are making modest but increasing contributions to affordable housing supply, the overall provision of social housing is falling in London, and much more must be done if supply of homes is to keep up with demand. In 2002, the UK's Conservative government implemented reforms to make the planning system less complex to invigorate home building. Major building groups such as the London First have recommended establishing a London-wide scheme setting minimum number of affordable houses built per development to add more certainty to the planning process and increase housing supply. However, the Conservative government planned to expand the right to buy policy to housing associations. This will cripple the housing associations, sending them bankrupt. Although it may be good politics, right to buy is poor policy as it stimulates demand and not supply, and will only exacerbate the housing crisis. This case study of London reveals the importance of a clear and consistent national planning framework and affordable housing as key policy objective, and concrete housing contribution requirements to ensure the supply of social housing in new developments. Compared to London, the use of the urban planning system to increase supply of social housing outcomes in Australia has been extremely limited. Given the high value markets of Sydney and London, a mandatory approach requiring compulsory minimum social housing contributions would result in the supply of far more houses. However, changes to the state planning policy would be required in New South Wales. Despite significant funding cuts, a large proportion of social homes in London and the UK are built by housing associations. However, Australia lacks financial incentive schemes to encourage the development of a not-for-profit housing sector. Compared to London, in Australia, housing, particularly social housing, has not been a priority of the federal or state governments. The London example has shown that without strategic government and private investment, the social and affordable housing crisis will not be addressed, as the use of planning levers alone will not achieve the supply of social housing that the city requires. Both cities need to lobby and collaborate with state and federal governments and other private partners to achieve a radical change, bold action, and political will required to encourage development of social housing and achieve their targets.